Hi, my name is Bianca Watt. I am a postgraduate student studying clinical neuropsychiatry. I will be presenting a short talk on the racial inequalities in psychedelic clinical trials. I am Jamaican American and a first-generation student. As an aspiring psychedelic researcher and therapist, I attend various online conferences, which would not be possible without scholarships, to stay up to date with the latest research in the re-emerging field of psychedelics. I began to observe that many of the speakers on these panels did not look like me. This lack of representation made me question why there is not more diversity within the psychedelic movement. So to begin this presentation, I would like to bring more awareness to the issue that the current reporting of demographic data in psychedelic clinical trials calls into question if the results are truly generalizable and for who. My concern is this runs the risk of potentially causing harm to underrepresented individuals by erasing their identity. So the demographic information that is typically reported in research includes characteristics such as age, gender, education, ethnicity, and race. When looking at the demographic data in psychedelic clinical trials, there are vast discrepancies in who is participating. The majority of participants identify as white. This inequality leaves marginalized communities underrepresented in research. So as the psychedelic renaissance continues to unfold, expanding our knowledge and understanding of how these psychedelic substances could work in a Western medical context, research should prioritize including a diverse participant population, as BIPOC individuals are severely underrepresented. To provide a definition of who may identify with this term, BIPOC includes Black, Indigenous, people of color, including Asian and Latinx individuals. Historically marginalized communities face and still face many of these experiences I have listed, including some on a daily basis. These various lived experiences contribute to health disparities. For example, the war on drugs has disproportionately criminalized POCs, leading to mass incarceration in the US due to unjust policies. Many individuals may also experience intergenerational trauma, in which trauma experienced is passed down to future generations via epigenetics. These are all inequalities experienced under the wider scope of systems of oppression. Marginalized communities experience the effects of these systems, which can impact an individual's physical and mental health. So BIPOC individuals may tremendously benefit from the healing potential of psychedelic-assisted therapy, but have not been adequately represented in the research. So although this discrepancy has been considered in the psychedelic research literature, to my knowledge, it has not been explored in depth across various clinical trials. The topic warrants more research as it is currently very limited. For those who are wondering, randomized clinical controlled trials are known as the gold standard in research for studying and evaluating if a treatment intervention can improve health outcomes. So I researched a total of 14 psychedelic clinical trials to see if this was a general trend across studies, and I found a similar pattern supporting the lack of diversity within trials. For participants who identified as white, this ranged from 72.2% up to 100% across the 14 studies. So I will be providing a couple examples of demographic data so we can take a closer look at how this data is being reported or the lack of reporting. The two psychedelic substances I will be discussing includes MDMA, also known as ecstasy, which is being researched for post-traumatic stress disorder. I will also discuss psilocybin, which is found in magic mushrooms, and that is currently being researched for depression and anxiety. I would like to note a limitation that this is not an exhaustive list of psychedelic substances being researched in clinical trials. This research I'm presenting is from a PubMed search of the two psychedelic substances of interest, only considering research within the last 5 years in the United States and the United Kingdom. So for this first study, investigated MDMA for PTSD. There's a total sample size of 28 participants. And within this study, 26 participants, or 92.9% of the sample, identified as white. The one participant who identified as Native American received 40 milligrams of MDMA, and then the other participant who identified as Latino Hispanic received 100 milligrams of MDMA. So out of the two underrepresented participants, neither of them received the highest dose of 125 milligrams of MDMA. I believe this is noteworthy because we can't draw adequate conclusions about dose-dependent effects in underrepresented groups if they're not allocated to all conditions. This next study also looked at MDMA for PTSD. It included a total sample of 90 participants. Within this study, participants were able to select ethnicity. This is categorized as identifying as Hispanic or Latino, which consisted of 8 participants, or 8.9% of the sample. Or participants could identify as not Hispanic or Latino, which consisted of 81 participants, or 90% of the sample. However, when we look at the race data that is presented, the 8 participants that were able to select Hispanic or Latino for their ethnicity were not given the option to also select it for their race. So it's unclear whether these participants had to select multiple races as their identity is no longer represented. I would also like to point out that the 2 participants that identified as Black or African American were not given the active treatment of MDMA, but they were allocated to the placebo condition with therapy. This next study looked at psilocybin in healthy controls. It included a total sample size of 89 participants. In this study, 72 participants identified as white, or 80.9% of the sample. I would like to note here again that the one participant that identified as Black did not receive the active treatment of psilocybin, but were randomly allocated to the placebo condition. I would also like to point out that demographic data could be improved by reporting accurately racial identities by including more representative categories. In this study, participants are able to select mixed race or other race. And it's concerning that participants who don't have a race represented they can identify with and have been deemed an other, which is dehumanizing and essentially erasing their identity from research. For this last study, it also looked at psilocybin, but for major depressive disorder. There was a total sample size of 24 participants. And in this study, 22 participants, or 92% of the sample, identified as white race ethnicity. So I'd like to mention that there is no data on the other two participants in this study, as they're not even represented within the table that is reported. So to summarize the demographic data, I compiled the data from the past 4 psychedelic clinical trials so we can really visualize the extent of the issue here. The total sample included 230 participants across studies. Collectively, 189 participants identified as white. This is approximately 82.17% of the sample. And I want to emphasize here that all other underrepresented groups combined totaled to 41 participants, which is approximately 17.82% of the sample. So these underrepresented groups combined collectively make up less than 1/5 of the entire sample of participants across 4 psychedelic clinical trials. So what are the research implications? These are just a few quotes from the discussion sections of the published research papers. I will read one for any example. The population is relatively homogeneous and lacks racial and ethnic diversity, which should be addressed in future trials. I wonder why this disparity is just a mere footnote in published research papers. It is generally a maximum of 1 sentence noting the ethnic and racial limitations. What actions can be taken by researchers to ensure there is adequate representation in research, instead of just addressing it as a limitation in which some future study should address the problem? But who will and when? There must be a solution. So the most common recruitment strategies in research include advertisements, either posters, printed posters, internet-based surveys, referrals from medical or mental health professionals, and word of mouth when recruiting. I did some investigative research and emailed researchers about why there was not adequate diversity within their studies and what the potential limitations were. And a few researchers replied, giving a number of explanations. Some of the limitations that were noted included things like willingness to volunteer, cultural beliefs and attitudes towards science and medicine, and the lack of connection with these communities in order to recruit a more diverse sample. So researchers are aware of the racial disparities in psychedelic clinical trials. Here is another response from a researcher I received. They noted how much was learned in past trials, which informed how they adjusted their recruitment strategies in order to have a more representative sample for their current studies. Overall, I did receive some very thoughtful responses from researchers about how they are addressing the issue. One researcher referred me to another researcher who's actively engaging in this work to increase representation. Another researcher sent me several publications about how they are addressing the issue with equity initiatives for future trials. So with that said, there are actions researchers can take to improve data collection and increase representation. So if there's one thing to take away from this presentation, I would like you to consider this question. If the most vulnerable communities are not participating in psychedelic clinical trials that will help inform evidence-based practices, How will this treatment be practically disseminated to a diverse, wider public once psychedelic-assisted therapies become available? So what can we do? In order to include more individuals in the reemerging field of psychedelic science and medicine, I am proposing these three factors, if addressed, can improve inclusivity. First, the study design in psychedelic clinical trials needs to be addressed. Researchers can start by clearly and specifically defining demographics for patient or participants to identify with, as well as provide more options of boxes to check during data collection instead of excluding individuals from scientific discourse. Second, obtain a diverse sample of participants by expanding recruitment strategies to be more ethnically and racially inclusive. This will contribute to greater representation and increase the external validity of research findings. Third, it will be imperative to educate and train culturally competent researchers and certified therapists moving forward in order to help individualize and tailor treatment for BIPOC communities. If we can collectively participate in addressing these issues, we may be able to create a future that fosters diversity and increases access to healing for all. So how does this translate from research to clinical practice? And what are the implications for clinical practice due to the inclusion of a variety of racial categories in clinical trials? If greater representation is achieved during the clinical research process, this can help minimize harms and reduce adverse effects while maximizing the safety of participants. This can help improve the quality of care for BIPOC individuals undergoing psychedelic-assisted therapy and treatment. By increasing diversity and improving access to resources such as clinical trials and therapy, there is the potential to treat race-based trauma and maximize healing for culturally diverse communities. This will better inform therapy to be culturally sensitive and help create individualized treatment for BIPOC communities when it comes to the reemergence of psychedelic medicine in the Western context. And what are the impacts on professional development? It is vital to have trained psychedelic researchers and therapists of BIPOC communities, as this is currently also an unmet need in the psychedelic clinical trials, therapy, and beyond. This will help increase safety and trust in clinical trials, bridge the gap between racial disparities in the research setting and the clinical context, while providing the opportunity for underrepresented individuals to expand their skill set and profession within the psychedelic field. The organization MAPS has begun to address this issue of inequality seen with lack of diverse therapists by creating an MDMA therapy training for communities of color as a means to explore the potential of MDMA to help heal racial trauma. This is just one example of creating pathways for BIPOC individuals to develop their skills within the psychedelic space. So in conclusion, I am arguing to optimize the healing potential of disseminating psychedelic-assisted therapy will require addressing the unmet need of including a diverse participant population in research. Furthermore, it will be important to educate and train researchers and certified therapists to be culturally competent. This can help increase safety and quality of care for underrepresented communities. By working together, we can increase access and equity in the psychedelic space which will allow for the possibility of more people to heal. If you haven't heard of the organization Fireside Project, I highly recommend checking them out. They offer free and confidential peer support during or after a psychedelic experience. So please check out their website and download the app. And then here is a list of references of the information and research studies I referred to during the presentation if you would like more access to the material. And thank you.